Christmas Eve, Eastern Washington. The storm doesn't announce itself. It arrives like a verdict. Ryder Graves has been riding through weather like this for 20 years. He knows the difference between cold that bites and cold that kills. Tonight, both are out. Then his headlight catches something in the ditch, something small, something barefoot. A little girl, 7 years old, stumbling through the snow in a torn nightgown, skin blue at the edges, eyes wide and hollow, like she'd already seen the end of the world. He didn't stop because he's a good man. He stopped because he recognized that look. He'd worn it himself once. What she whispers in his ear 30 minutes later will burn down the most powerful empire in the state. Stay with me, people. This one goes all the way down. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. The blizzard came in from the north just after sundown, the way bad things always come. Quietly at first, then all at once. By 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve, Interstate 90 through eastern Washington had been reduced to a single lane of blind faith. Semi-trucks jackknifed in the median, families stranded in rest stops with their hazard lights blinking like distress signals nobody was reading. The state patrol had pulled off the highway an hour ago. Smart move, maybe. Survival instinct. But survival instinct doesn't account for everyone. Ryder Graves rode into the storm like a man who'd already decided the storm didn't get a vote. He was 46 years old, which meant he looked 60 on good days and somewhere beyond classification on bad ones. His face was a topographic map of decisions. A scar that ran from the left corner of his jaw up through his cheekbone, legacy of Fallujah, and a piece of shrapnel that the military surgeon said came within 4 millimeters of his orbital socket. His hands were thick, the knuckles permanently swollen from work he didn't talk about, from fights he'd mostly won and a few he'd deliberately lost. He wore a leather jacket that was older than most marriages he'd witnessed, the back panel showing the ghost of a patch he'd had removed 6 years ago with a heat gun and grinding patience. The absence of that patch was its own kind of statement. His Harley was a 2003 Road King, black over black, the chrome dulled to a gunmetal gray that matched the sky. He rode it the way you ride something that's kept you alive, with respect and zero illusions. The engine ran rough in cold weather, always had, a persistent low-frequency shudder at idle that he'd never bothered fixing because he'd learned a long time ago that the things that shudder are the things still running. He wasn't supposed to be in Washington state at all. He'd been in Boise 2 days ago, doing day labor at a warehouse that stored agricultural equipment, loading pallets of seed bags onto flatbeds for minimum wage, and no questions about the gaps in his work history. The foreman had been decent enough, a heavy-set man named Ortega who chewed tobacco and didn't care about your past as long as you showed up and moved weight. Graves had planned to stay through New Year's, maybe longer if Ortega kept the offers coming. He had a cot at a weekly motel 4 blocks from the warehouse, a hot plate, a battery-powered radio. It wasn't much, but then he'd stopped measuring his life in much a long time ago. He'd left because of a phone call. The call came at 11 p.m. 2 nights before Christmas, a number he recognized but hadn't heard from in 14 months. Priest. That was what people called him. Not a religious title, just a road name that stuck from some incident in New Mexico that nobody who was there fully agreed on the details of. Priest was the road captain for the Iron Saints MC out of Spokane, a man Graves had ridden with for 3 years before everything fell apart, before the vote, before Graves had packed his gear into 2 saddlebags and ridden south without saying goodbye to anyone except the chapter dog, a half-deaf beagle named Corporal who slept under the bar. "We've got a situation," Priest had said on the phone. No greeting, no preamble. "Not my situation anymore," Graves had said. "It might be." "Priest, just ride. If you get here and you don't want in, you don't have to be in, but ride." He hadn't said yes. He'd hung up the phone and stared at the ceiling of his motel room for 90 minutes, listening to the weather report on the battery radio, watching the shadows from passing cars sweep across the water stains above his cot. Then he'd gotten up, packed his bags, and pointed the Road King north. He told himself it was curiosity. He was reasonably certain that was a lie. The storm had found him somewhere around Ritzville, still 40 miles from Spokane, and it had been escalating ever since. Snow coming sideways, visibility down to 40 feet, the temperature sitting at 11 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill that turned exposed skin to a liability. Graves rode slow and methodical, leaning into the wind, reading the road surface through the handlebars the way you read Braille, by feel, by pressure, by the tiny variations in resistance that told you whether the asphalt under the snow was dry or glazed or completely gone. He almost missed her. The headlight caught the movement in the right-hand ditch, a pale smear against the white, something low to the ground and moving wrong. He registered it at the edge of his peripheral vision and had already passed it when his brain finished processing what his eyes had seen. He braked, controlled and deliberate, felt the rear wheel search for purchase and find it, pulled to the shoulder and stopped. He sat for a moment, engine idling, staring at his mirrors. There was nothing to see, just snow and darkness and the ghost shapes of fence posts along the highway shoulder. He put the kickstand down and walked back. She was in the ditch, maybe 15 feet from the road's edge, crouched against a concrete drainage culvert like she was trying to become part of it. 7 years old, maybe 8. It was hard to tell because she was so small, or maybe she was small because whatever had happened to her had shrunk her. Nightgown, white cotton with small yellow flowers soaked through and frozen stiff at the hem. No coat, no shoes. Her feet were bare in the snow, the toes red going purple, and her arms were wrapped around her own torso in the particular way that meant she'd stopped shivering, which was worse than shivering, much worse, because shivering meant the body was still fighting. Her eyes were open, dark brown, enormous in her pale face, and they tracked him as he came down the embankment. She didn't run, she didn't scream, she just watched him the way small animals watch large predators, with a stillness that has moved past fear into something quieter and more terrible. He'd seen that look before. Combat. On faces that had already made their peace. "Hey," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, stripped raw by the wind. "Hey, I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond. He crouched down, making himself smaller, putting himself at her level. The snow was soaking through his jeans at the knees, and he didn't care. "My name is Ryder. What's your name?" "Nothing." "Okay." He held both hands up, palms out, the universal slow-down signal, the way you'd approach something wild and frightened. "You don't have to tell me, but I need to get you out of this snow, all right? If you stay here, you're going to—" He stopped himself from finishing that sentence. "It's not safe here. I've got a bike. It's warm enough. Can I carry you?" Still nothing. But something in her eyes shifted. Not trust, not yet, not even close to trust, but a kind of calculation. The look of someone who has learned that all options are bad and is trying to determine which one is least bad. He took off his leather jacket. The cold hit him immediately, vicious and thorough, slicing through his flannel shirt like it wasn't there. He wrapped the jacket around her shoulders, both sleeves, folded it over twice at the front because she was swimming in it. The leather was still warm from his body. She flinched when it touched her, but she didn't pull away. He picked her up. She was light in a way that alarmed him, the kind of light that meant not enough of anything for too long. She went rigid for a moment, every muscle locked, and then something in her gave and she pressed her face against his chest, and he felt her shaking, fine tremors running through her whole body. He carried her back up the embankment to the bike. He'd done a wilderness first aid course in the Army, retained enough of it to know the priority was core temperature. He sat her across the tank, facing him, both her small legs draped over his left thigh, the jacket bundled around her, and he got on and wrapped his arms around her to reach the handlebars, and she was enclosed in the circle of his body and the engine heat coming up through the frame. He gave the throttle 3 seconds of high idle to build warmth, and then he pulled back onto the highway. He had a destination now. Priest had given him an address during the phone call, a factory building on the east side of Spokane, a shuttered agricultural equipment manufacturer that the Saints had been using for 2 years. Underground, off the books, the kind of place you found only if someone who trusted you told you where it was. Graves had never been there, had been out of the chapter before it was established, but he had the address memorized because Priest had made him repeat it back twice, and Graves understood what that meant. It meant there was something there that mattered. He rode. The child pressed against him, small and cold, and gradually, tentatively, warming. She hadn't spoken. He didn't push it. He'd learned in a different life that silence after trauma was a form of survival, and the worst thing you could do was try to break it too fast. At some point, when the lights of Spokane's outer suburbs began to emerge from the blizzard ahead of them, she moved, just slightly. Her head turned, her lips near his collar, and she said something. He couldn't hear it over the engine and the wind. He leaned his head down. Say that again? Her voice was barely there, cracked and dry, the voice of someone who hadn't had water in hours. He'll know, she whispered. He always knows. He didn't ask who, not yet. He filed it, stored it in the same place he stored things that needed to be understood before they were acted on, and he kept writing. The factory was on Trent Avenue, set back from the road behind a chain-link fence, with a for sale sign that had been weathering for so long its text was barely legible. The building itself was a long, low structure of industrial brick, the windows boarded, the loading dock at the far end accessible through a side gate that Graves had been told would be unlocked. It was. He rolled through the gate and around the side of the building and found what Priest had said he'd find. A metal door at ground level, the kind built for utility access, with a light above it, a single red bulb in a wire cage, burning steady through the snow. He killed the engine and sat for a moment in the abrupt silence that followed, the blizzard filling the void with its hiss and moan. The child hadn't moved. We're here, he said. He got off the bike and lifted her, still wrapped in the leather jacket, and carried her to the door and kicked it twice with his boot, hard and deliberate, the pattern Priest had given him on the phone. A long pause. Then the sound of a bolt being thrown. The door opened onto a staircase going down, and the man holding it open was not Priest. He was younger, mid-30s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a cut with a prospect patch, and a look that combined wariness and professional evaluation in equal measure. His eyes moved from Graves's face to the child and back to Graves, and whatever he was about to say changed behind his eyes. Get Priest, Graves said. The prospect said nothing, just turned and went down the stairs fast, and Graves followed. Below the factory floor was a space that had originally served as a maintenance basement. Concrete walls, concrete floor, low ceilings with exposed pipe and ductwork. It had been transformed over time into something functional and unlikely. A workshop along one wall, a kitchen of sorts around a commercial-grade hot plate, and a chest freezer, folding tables, military surplus cots along the far wall, a wood stove in the corner that was putting out serious heat. The walls were hung with the detritus of long-term occupation, maps, schedules, the random personal effects of men who spent time in places they couldn't fully call home. A generator hummed somewhere behind a partition. A single bare bulb hung on an extension cord above the center of the room, throwing hard shadows. There were 4 men already there when Graves came down the stairs. He recognized 2 of them. The others regarded him with the careful neutrality of men who'd been told about him but hadn't met him yet. Then Priest came through a door at the far end, and the room recalibrated. Priest was 51, thin in the way that suggested the thinness was enforced, a body that had burned through its reserves and kept going anyway. His hair had gone fully gray in the 3 years since Graves had seen him, but his eyes were the same, pale blue and precise as a surveyor's instrument. He wore his road captain's cut over a thermal Henley, and he moved through the room with the unhurried purposefulness of someone who had long since stopped wasting motion on anything that didn't matter. He looked at Graves. He looked at the child. Tell me, he said. Highway 90 east of Ritzville, in a ditch off the shoulder. Graves shifted the child's weight in his arms. No coat, no shoes. Core temp is probably borderline. She needs medical attention now, not in an hour. Priest turned without hesitation. Boone. From behind the partition came another man, stocky, 50-ish, with forearms like structural elements and a pair of reading glasses pushed up into thinning hair. Boone was the Saints medic, or had been when Graves knew him. Retired Army combat medic, 2 tours, currently unlicensed to practice anything in any state, and arguably more competent than most licensed practitioners Graves had encountered. He came forward and Graves transferred the child to him, and Boone carried her to the nearest cot and laid her down with a gentleness that was at odds with his architecture. How long in the cold? Boone asked. Unknown. She was there when I found her. Could have been an hour, could have been longer. What's her name? Graves looked at the child. She was looking back at him from the cot, the leather jacket still wrapped around her, her dark eyes tracking everything in the room with that terrible animal alertness. She hasn't told me. Boone nodded, turned to his kit. Okay, sweetheart, he said to the child, his voice dropping to something softer, almost unrecognizable from his usual register. I'm just going to check you out, make sure everything's working right. Is that okay? The child looked at Graves. He moved to the edge of the cot and crouched down to her level again. "Boone's going to help you," he said. "He knows what he's doing. I'll stay right here." Something passed across her face. A microsecond of calculation, and then a decision. The decision she'd made in the ditch when she'd chosen the least bad option. She looked back at Boone and gave a single small nod. Boone began his assessment, and the room quietly reorganized itself around the fact of the child's presence. Men who had been sitting stood up. Men who had been talking went quiet. The wood stove got fed. Someone produced a wool blanket. Someone else started water for what Graves assumed was either coffee or broth, and it turned out to be both, produced with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to emergencies. Priest came to stand beside Graves at the edge of the cot's radius. "This is what you called me up here for?" Graves said quietly. "No." Priest's voice was equally low. "This is something else, something we found before you got here." A pause. "The situation I called you about is related. Or it might be. We're still working it out." "Related how?" "Give Boone 20 minutes. Graves looked at the child. Boone had her feet in his hands, checking the toes for frostbite damage, talking to her steadily in a low murmur, explaining each thing before he did it. She was watching him with an attention that was still wary, but had moved a degree or two toward trust. Kids, Graves had observed over years, were often better at reading people than adults. They hadn't yet learned to override their instincts with rationalization. If she was allowing Boone near her, it meant Boone was putting off signals she could read as safe. He gave Boone 20 minutes. Boone's assessment took longer, which was either a bad sign or the sign of someone being thorough. Graves stood against the wall with a cup of coffee, dark, no sugar, the way he'd drunk it for 20 years, and watched the room. Watched Priest moving through it, stopping to speak quietly to each of the men, the practiced orchestration of a man managing a situation in real time. Watched the prospect from the door, who'd been given the name Dutch when someone introduced him in passing, watching the child with an expression that contained more emotion than the rest of his face knew how to accommodate. Watched the snow gathering in the small, high basement windows that let in a dim winter light from the parking lot above. He was on his third cup of coffee when Boone straightened up from the cot and walked to him. "She's stable," Boone said low. "Toes are going to be sore for a week, but no permanent damage. Core temp was down, she's coming back. She's dehydrated, and she's had nothing to eat in a while." He paused. "Graves. Yeah, she's got bruising." Boone kept his voice level, professional, the voice of a man who has learned to report findings without letting what he felt about them contaminate the accuracy of the report. "Upper arms, consistent with being grabbed hard, repeatedly. Older bruising on the ribs, at least a week old, maybe 2. And..." A pause that lasted 2 full seconds. "Her back. There are marks on her back that are consistent with a belt or a strap. Some of them have scarring, which means they're not recent. Some of them are." Graves said nothing for a moment. The coffee in his hand had gone cold without him noticing. "How recent?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "Within the last 48 hours. He set the coffee cup down carefully on a nearby table, the precision of a man managing something in himself that required management. He looked across the room at the child on the cot, small under the wool blanket, the leather jacket folded beside her, her eyes closed now. Not sleep, not yet, but the exhausted near sleep of someone whose body had finally decided it was marginally safe enough to let its guard down for 30 seconds. He thought about the cold in her feet when he'd found her, the weight of her in the ditch, less than nothing, like carrying a bundle of something that had been hollowed out. He thought about what she'd whispered on the bike. He'll know, he always knows. "Priest," he said. The road captain appeared at his elbow as if he'd been waiting. "Talk to me," Graves said. Priest led him to the far end of the basement, past the partition, into a smaller space that served as an office. A folding table, a laptop, a board on the wall with photographs and printed documents connected by colored tape, the classic visual syntax of investigation. Graves had seen boards like this before, in different contexts, and the sight of it told him that whatever he'd ridden into, it had been going on for a while. 17 days ago, Priest said, standing in front of the board, a woman walked into a gas station on Division Street at 3 in the morning, barefoot, wearing a hospital gown. She was incoherent and she was injured. Contusions on her head consistent with a fall or a strike, broken collarbone, beginning stages of hypothermia. Who was she? The attendant called 911. She was taken to Sacred Heart. Priest pointed to a photograph on the board. A hospital corridor, grainy, shot from distance. When she got there, she was still partially incoherent. She kept saying a name, and she kept saying she needed to get to her daughter. The intake nurse documented this. He tapped a printed form on the board. 4 hours later, 2 men arrived at the hospital. Not police, not family. They had paperwork. A court order establishing guardianship over the woman, authorizing her transfer to a private psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment. The paperwork was signed by a judge. What kind of paperwork? The kind that moves fast. Too fast for something legitimate. Priest turned from the board. The woman's name is Celeste Cross. She's 31 years old. The court order transferring her was signed within 3 hours of her admission to Sacred Heart. Normally, that kind of order takes days at minimum. Who filed for it? Priest reached over and tapped a photograph in the upper left corner of the board. The photograph was a newspaper clipping, and the man in it was the kind of man newspaper clippings were made for. Mid-50s, silver at the temples, the kind of handsome that suggested professional grooming and a relationship with mirrors. He was standing at what appeared to be a charity gala, his arm around a woman who wasn't looking at him, and he was smiling with the specific high-wattage confidence of someone accustomed to cameras. Beneath the photograph, the caption read, Vincent Harrow at the annual Harrow Foundation Gala. Harrow's foundation distributed $4.2 million to Eastern Washington Children's Services programs this year. Harrow Foundation, Graves said. Vincent Harrow, billionaire. Real estate, private equity, some tech, some development projects. He's been on the governor's shortlist for a commerce appointment. He's on the boards of half the nonprofits in the state. He's the keynote speaker at every Chamber of Commerce dinner from here to Seattle. And he filed the transfer order. His lawyers did. Within 3 hours of Celeste Cross walking into that gas station, Harrow's legal team had a signed court order and she was moved to the Cascadia View Institute. That's a private residential psychiatric facility in the mountains, 40 miles east of here, operated by a management group with ties to a Harrow-owned holding company. Priest paused. She's been there for 17 days. We've tried to get a welfare check through official channels. The facility says she's a voluntary patient. The judge who signed the order isn't returning calls. The detective we know on Spokane PD ran a quiet inquiry and was told by his supervisor to drop it. Graves stood in front of the board for a long time. What's her connection to Harrow? Celeste Cross was employed by the Harrow Foundation for 8 years, director of community programs. By all accounts, she was trusted, gave everything to the organization. A pause. She was also, based on what we've been able to piece together from people who knew her, the primary caregiver for a daughter she'd had before she joined the foundation. Graves turned slowly. A daughter, 7 years old, named Ivy. The name landed in the room and settled there, and Graves heard it the same way you hear the click of a mechanism that's been building toward an unlock. He looked back through the partition at the child on the cot, the small, dark-haired girl with the eyes that knew too much. How long has she been with Harrow? He asked. Since Celeste was institutionalized, he was named emergency guardian. Priest's voice was very controlled. The court order establishing that was signed by the same judge. Graves said nothing. We found out about the girl because a woman at one of Harrow's properties called the Saints Tip Line, anonymously, said she worked cleaning staff at his residence outside Spokane and she'd seen things that... Priest stopped, started again. She didn't finish the call. She hung up. We've been sitting on this for 12 days trying to figure out an angle, trying to find someone inside who'd talk, trying to get to the girl through legitimate means. He looked at Graves directly. Then you called and said you were coming. I didn't say I was coming. I said I'd think about it. And here you are. Graves walked back out through the partition to the main room. He went to the cot and stood over it and looked at the child. She'd opened her eyes when she heard his footsteps. She looked up at him with that calculation, that constant weighing of odds. Ivy, he said. Something in her face changed, not alarm, but a kind of relief. The relief of being correctly identified, which was its own form of being seen. He thinks you're dead, Graves said. The storm. He'll think the storm got you. She didn't respond to that. She was watching him with those old eyes in her small face, and he thought about what those eyes had seen, and he felt something move in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time, something that had been sealed off with deliberate care for reasons he'd spent years not examining. He had a sister. Had. Past tense, though she was technically alive somewhere. He'd stopped keeping track, or told himself he had. Younger than him by 9 years. Same dark eyes. He'd been 17 when their father started, 18 when he'd left for the army without fully admitting to himself what he was leaving behind, without staying long enough to make sure she was going to be all right, without doing the one thing that might have mattered. He had spent 28 years not examining that. "Nobody's going to hurt you here," he said to Ivy. He said it the way you say things when you're not entirely sure they're in your power to guarantee, but you're willing to stake something on them anyway. "You understand?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "There's a key." He went still. "What kind of key?" She reached up to her neck, under the wool blanket, and pulled out a locket on a thin silver chain. It was small, heart-shaped, the kind of thing that came from a jewelry store that sold to mothers. She held it out toward him, but didn't let go of it, held it between her fingers and extended it in his direction, an offer that was also a test. "My mom gave it to me," she said, "before they took her. She said if anything ever happened to keep it safe." She said, she stopped, and something crossed her face that was too old for her face, a grief that had been living in a body too small to hold it. She said the key inside would protect us. He looked at the locket, small and battered, the silver worn where it had been held and held and held by small hands. "Can I see it?" She pulled it back toward herself, closed her fingers around it. "Not yet," she said. And in that moment, with the blizzard pressing against the windows above and the wood stove burning and the iron saints moving quietly through the space around them, Ryder Graves understood 3 things with complete clarity. The first was that the child was going to be all right, or at least that he was going to spend whatever it cost him to make her all right. The second was that whatever was in that locket, Harrow knew it existed, which meant the cleaning woman's call to the tip line, Celeste's desperate escape from wherever she'd been held, Ivy running barefoot into a blizzard. None of it was random. It was the last moves of a woman who had understood exactly how this game was played and had spent years setting up the only endgame she could see. The third thing was this. A man with Vincent Harrow's resources and Vincent Harrow's connections and Vincent Harrow's record of making problems disappear would be looking for the child by morning, maybe sooner. He would have people. He would have reach. And the Iron Saints' basement safe house, however well hidden, had just received a very conspicuous visitor via a very loud motorcycle in a very significant storm. He went to Priest. "We have a window," he said. "However long it takes him to figure out she's alive and start looking. Could be hours. Could be less." "I know. We need to move her, and we need to start building a case so fast that by the time he finds out she's here, touching her becomes the thing that finishes him instead of the thing that saves him." Priest looked at him with those pale surveyor's eyes. "So you're in," he said. Graves thought about the girl in the ditch, thought about what Boone had found, thought about a signed court order that moved in 3 hours, and a judge who wasn't returning calls, and a building full of men who'd tried to do this right and kept hitting walls that didn't exist until someone powerful enough decided to build them. He thought about a 17-year-old who got on a bus to Fort Benning and told himself there was nothing else he could have done. "Get everyone in here," he said, "and somebody get that kid something to eat." Priest turned to the room and did not raise his voice, did not announce anything, just made a small gesture. And the men who had been giving the space its respectful quiet began to draw in toward the center with the specific gravity of people who understood that the meeting had begun. Dutch, the prospect, was first to the cot. He'd produced a granola bar from somewhere in his cut, the foil worn at the corners from being carried a while, and he held it out to Ivy with the self-consciousness of a large man trying to make himself small, and she took it with both hands and looked at it for a second, and then began eating it in careful, deliberate bites. Not the ravenous attack of desperate hunger, but the controlled pacing of someone who had learned not to trust abundance. Graves watched that and felt the sealed place in his chest push against its seal. Outside, the blizzard had begun, very slightly, to ease. In the partial silence that followed the worst of the wind, he could hear the cold settling into the city around them, the creak and pop of buildings contracting, the distant sound of a snowplow working somewhere on Trent Avenue, The ordinary sounds of a world that did not know what was in this basement, what was gathering in this basement. The Iron Saints pulled their chairs into a rough circle around the wood stove. Graves took a place at the edge, closer to the cot than to the stove, in the specific position of a man who is part of the meeting and simultaneously keeping watch over something separate from the meeting. Priest stood. "All right," he said. "Here's what we know, and here's what we don't know yet, and here's what we need to know before morning." He began to talk, and somewhere across the city, in a residence that occupied the top 3 floors of a building whose lobby was decorated with the kind of art that costs more than most people's houses, a phone rang. A man answered it. He listened for 30 seconds, his face giving nothing away, the face of someone who had trained himself to receive bad news with the same expression he received good news, because the people around him were always watching. When he ended the call, he set the phone down on the marble surface of his desk and sat very still for a moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a different phone, older, simpler, not connected to anything that bore his name, and he dialed a number from memory. "The child isn't in the house," he said when the call connected. "Find her." He didn't say please. He never said please. People who said please were asking. He was not asking. The call ended. He put the phone back in the drawer and closed it and walked to the window and stood looking out at the city below, the snow falling through the glow of the streetlights, the empty Christmas Eve streets, the dark and frozen river in the distance. He had built a great deal in his life. He had built it carefully, and he had built it to last, and he had built it in full understanding that anything built could be threatened. He had been threatened before, in various ways, by various people, and those threats had been handled, and the people who had made them had been handled, and the machine had kept running. The child was 7 years old. She was somewhere in a blizzard. He was not concerned. He should have been. In a basement beneath an abandoned factory on Trent Avenue, the little girl with the dark eyes and the locket she wouldn't release had fallen asleep with a half-eaten granola bar in her hand. And the man sitting in the chair beside her cot, the scarred man in the leather jacket who hadn't planned to be here and had ridden 400 miles into a blizzard on the word of someone he owed nothing to, was watching her sleep with an expression on his face that he wouldn't have recognized in a mirror. The locket lay on her chest, rising and falling with her breath, and whatever was inside it was either going to end Vincent Harrow or it was going to get every person in this basement killed trying. By morning, Ryder Graves would know which. Priest talked for 40 minutes without stopping. He laid it out the way a man lays out a map he's been drawing in the dark, not with confidence, but with the particular precision of someone who knows exactly where the edges of his knowledge end and the unknown begins, and refuses to pretend otherwise. The other men listened without interrupting. That was the discipline, the thing that separated the Saints from a group of angry men in a basement, which on the surface was what they appeared to be. They listened until he was done. When he finished, the silence that followed had texture to it. "What do we actually have?" said the man they called Cutter. He was the oldest in the room after Priest, late 50s, with a gray beard trimmed close and the hands of someone who had spent decades doing mechanical work, permanently stained at the nail beds, the knuckles enlarged. He'd been road captain before Priest, before a fall on black ice outside Coeur d'Alene had fused 2 vertebrae and rearranged his relationship with long rides. Now he was sergeant-at-arms, which meant he was the man responsible for not walking the chapter into a situation that got people killed. Not what we suspect, not what makes sense. What do we actually have right now that we could put in front of someone? "We have the girl," Dutch said from the corner. "The girl is a victim. That's not nothing, but it's not evidence." "We have Boone's assessment," Graves said. Cutter looked at him. The look was not hostile, but it was not warm. It was the look of a man recalibrating his view of another man based on new information and still deciding what to do with it. Graves had ridden with the Saints for 3 years, but that had been a different chapter, a different time. And there were men in this room who had heard his name but had never heard it attached to anything that made them comfortable. "Boone's assessment," Cutter said, "is the assessment of an unlicensed medic in a room that doesn't officially exist about a child who was found on a highway by a man who is not a member of this chapter, who has not been voted in, and whose presence here has not been formally discussed." "That's a lot of formality for a little girl with belt marks on her back," Graves said. "That's not what I said." "That's what you meant." The room shifted, not loudly. Nothing moved, no chairs scraped, Nobody stood up. But the quality of the air changed, the way air changes in the half second before weather. Priest said, "Enough." One word, medium volume. The specific tone of a man who has never needed to raise his voice because the weight behind it is understood. Both men pulled back, not because they'd been ordered to, but because Priest had made it clear that neither of them was wrong and both of them needed to be in the room for what came next. Cutter's point stands, Priest said. We need to think about what we're holding and what it can do for us, and what it can be used against us. He looked at Graves. And Graves's point stands. There's a child in this room. That changes the geometry of every other consideration. Cutter exhaled through his nose. A long breath, the kind that contains an argument being let go. What about the locket? He said. She won't give it up yet, Graves said. She will, Boone said from across the room. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, the reading glasses still pushed up into his hair. She will when she decides we're worth it. You can't rush that. We might not have time to not rush it, Dutch said. Then we're doing this wrong, Boone said. You push that kid, you push her away. She's 7 years old, and she's been through something the rest of us would have broken under. You want her cooperation? You earn it. There isn't another way that works. Nobody argued with that. Boone was not an easy man to argue with on things that lived inside his specific competence, which was the competence of someone who had treated wounded people for 20 years and understood that the psychological wound and the physical wound were not separate problems. Graves stood up. I need air. He went up the stairs and out the metal door into the cold, and the blizzard received him. It had eased further in the last hour, the worst of it having moved east, but it was still dark and still bitter and still snowing steadily, the kind of snow that comes down in small, dense flakes and accumulates fast. He stood against the factory wall with his hands in his jeans pockets and his flannel shirt doing nothing useful against the temperature, and he breathed. 46 years old, and he was standing behind an abandoned building in the dark on Christmas morning, the inside of his chest doing something complicated that he didn't have clean language for. He took out his cigarettes. He'd been down to 3 for 2 days, rationing them the way you ration things when you're not sure when the next supply is coming. He lit one and smoked it in slow, deliberate pulls, looking up at the sky where the snow was falling and the clouds had closed off everything above them. No stars, no moon, just the orange-gray ceiling of a winter city pressing down. He'll know. He always knows. He'd heard things like that before, in different mouths, in different circumstances, usually from people who had been living inside someone else's control for so long that the control had become a feature of the landscape, something as real and permanent as weather. The terrifying thing about that kind of power, real power, the kind built from money and connections and years of careful maintenance, was that it very often was what it appeared to be. Self-sustaining, pervasive. The kind of thing that made people at gas stations hang up anonymous tip line calls because they were afraid a phone call could be traced, and they were probably not wrong. He finished the cigarette and crushed it under his boot and went back inside. The meeting had moved on without him. Priest had divided the room into tasks. Ruiz and a man named Garza were going to make a quiet pass by the Harrow residence. Not close, just a drive-by assessment, counting vehicles, looking for activity, the kind of surveillance that leaves no footprint. A man named Holloway, who turned out to be the chapter's unofficial intelligence resource, which meant he'd spent 8 years as an Army signal intelligence analyst before a discharge that Graves gathered was related to a difference of opinion about rules of engagement, was at the laptop, working through the public record on Harrow and the Cascadia View Institute, finding the gaps in the record, which were often more informative than the record itself. Dutch was back at the cot, not hovering, just present. He'd found a second granola bar from somewhere and placed it within Ivy's reach, close enough for her to take it on her own terms, far enough that it didn't feel like an offer she had to respond to. The kid was still asleep, which meant she trusted the room at least to the degree required for sleep, which meant more than it might seem. Graves watched Dutch for a moment. The prospect was doing something that looked effortless but wasn't. He was maintaining proximity without pressure, available without demanding, the specific skill of someone who understood that trust in traumatized people moved at its own pace and couldn't be accelerated by good intentions. Where'd he come from? Graves said quietly to Priest. Priest followed his gaze to Dutch. His real name is Daniel. He's been a prospect 8 months. He was a social worker before. Graves looked at him. Not a story he tells much, Priest said. He worked Child Protective Services in Portland for 4 years. He got one wrong. Didn't pull a kid from a home when he should have. Kid ended up in the hospital. He paused. Kid survived. Dutch didn't survive being the person who missed it. Graves looked back at Dutch, at the way the man sat with his elbows on his knees and his big hands loose and his eyes steady on the girl's sleeping face, with the kind of attention that contained something old and specific and unresolved. He didn't have to do anything to earn his prospect patch, Priest said quietly. He earned it the first day he walked in because he already understood what this is for. Graves said nothing. Why did you leave? Priest said. Not accusatory. Just the question. Standing there. You know why. I know what you told us. I'm asking what's actually true. The space between them was 4 feet of concrete floor and several years of things unsaid. Graves looked at the board on the wall, at the photograph of Vincent Harrow with his charity gala smile and his silver temples. The chapter voted to walk away from the Denton situation, Graves said. I thought that was wrong. I still think it was wrong. The Denton situation was going to get 3 of our people killed. And walking away meant Denton kept running his operation and 2 women who were counting on us. Those women made it out, Priest said. We got them out through other channels. It took longer. It cost more. But they made it. Graves went quiet. You didn't know that, Priest said. No, because you left before we finished the job. Not accusatory, just a fact, sitting there between them, patient. I'm not rehashing it. I'm saying there are things you didn't know because you weren't here to know them. And I'm saying that pattern, leaving before things are finished because staying feels impossible, that's the thing I needed to know you dealt with before I called you. And you're here. Priest looked at him. That's either an answer or you're still figuring it out. Graves looked at the child on the cot. Still figuring it out, he said. Priest almost smiled. Not quite, but the possibility of it passed across his face. Good enough, he said, and walked toward Holloway and the laptop. It was 4 in the morning when Holloway said, Come look at this. The chapter gathered around the laptop. The screen showed a corporate registration document, 3 layers removed from Harrow's name, a holding company, which owned a management company, which operated Cascadia View Institute under a subsidiary that had a different name and a different board, but shared 3 directors with the management company. And one of those directors was a woman named Elaine Moretti, who appeared on the Harrow Foundation's board. And another was a man named Gerald Strauss, who appeared as a signatory on legal filings associated with 2 of Harrow's largest real estate acquisitions. The institute is his, Holloway said. 3 layers deep, but it's his. He puts people there. They're not patients. They're prisoners. Can you prove that? Cutter asked. I can prove the ownership structure. I can't prove what happens inside. Celeste Cross is what happens inside, Graves said. If she can talk to us, Priest said. If she remembers. If what she remembers is coherent. She was coherent enough to plan this, Graves said, gesturing toward Ivy on the cot, toward the locket. Whatever they've been giving her, she had enough clarity at some point to set up a contingency, to give her daughter a key and tell her what to do with it. That's not someone who's lost everything. That's someone they're trying to make lose everything, Boone said from the wall. There's a difference. A silence settled over the room, productive and grim. The judge, Graves said. Who is he? Holloway typed without being asked. A new document appeared. Honorable Richard Weil, Superior Court, Spokane County, 17 years on the bench. Before that, private practice with a firm that represented 3 companies connected to Harrow interests. Is that provable? It's public record. The connection is obvious. Whether it constitutes corruption is a question for a lawyer. Not our kind of lawyer, Cutter said. No. Graves thought for a moment. Harrow knows the girl is gone, he said. He might think she's dead in the storm, but he's not going to assume that. He'll be looking. He paused. And when he looks, what does he find? He finds the same infrastructure that gave him Celeste. Cops who drop inquiries when told, a judge who signs orders fast, people at every lever. So if we walk into any part of the legitimate system with this, we're walking into something he's already occupied. Not every part, Priest said. Which part isn't? Priest looked at Holloway. The federal angle. Holloway nodded slowly. If there's a pattern, and the ownership structure suggests there could be more than just Celeste Cross in that facility, that's potentially a federal civil rights matter. Involuntary commitment used to imprison, not treat. There are federal statutes. Who do you know? Graves said to Priest. Nobody I'd walk up to cold. There's a woman, federal public defender. She worked a case with Holloway 3 years ago. She's not a fan of the Saints, but she's not a fan of Harrow either. And she's not the kind of person who walks away from a civil rights violation because the source is inconvenient. You trust her? I trust her more than the system she works in, which is saying something. Reach out to her, Graves said. It's 4 a.m. on Christmas. Then she's probably not in her office. Priest looked at him. Then he picked up his phone. The call went to voicemail. He left a message that was brief and specific enough to convey urgency without conveying anything that would be a problem if the voicemail were ever subpoenaed. A name, a number, and 3 words. It's important. Please. They settled in to wait for morning. Graves took a position on a cot across from Ivy's. Not sleeping, not trying to sleep. He'd gone beyond tired somewhere around Ritzville and had come out the other side into that gray, flat-effect state of exhaustion where the body is running on momentum and the mind has reduced itself to observation. He observed. The wood stove. The snow in the high windows taking on the faint violet quality of pre-dawn. Holloway at the laptop, still working. The man apparently having no relationship with sleep at all. Dutch, who had fallen asleep in his chair with his chin on his chest, still positioned between the door and Ivy's cot, like a large, unconscious obstacle. At some point in the early morning, Ivy woke up. She didn't make a sound. She sat up in the cot with the wool blanket around her shoulders and looked at the room, taking inventory, checking that the geography of safety matched what she'd registered before she slept. Her eyes moved from Dutch to Holloway to the door to Graves. She looked at Graves for a long moment. Then she got up off the cot, carrying the blanket around her like a cloak, and walked across the floor in the wool socks someone had found for her feet and sat down on the edge of the cot beside him. He didn't move, didn't speak, just made the space available. She sat there for a while in silence. Then, "Do you have kids?" "No." "Why not?" He thought about whether to answer that honestly, decided she'd earned honesty more than most. "Because I didn't stay anywhere long enough." She considered this. "Where do you go?" "Different places." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Easier to move than to stay." She seemed to think about this with genuine consideration, not the politeness of a child who asks questions without caring about the answer, but the attention of someone working through a problem. "My mom stayed," she said, "even when it was hard. She stayed because of me." A pause. She said that. She said, "I stay because of you." He felt something inside him that he did not have the equipment to fully process, and so he just held it. "We're going to get her back," he said. "Your mom. That's what this is about. All these people, all this." He gestured at the room, the basement, the board on the wall. "We're going to bring her home." Ivy looked at him, 7 years old with those ancient eyes. "People say things like that," she said carefully. "Not accusatory, just precise." "I know they do. Do you mean it?" He held her gaze. "Yes." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she reached up to her neck and unclasped the locket and held it out in her palm. It was small, the silver worn to near white at the edges, the heart shape slightly bent on one side, the kind of damage that came from years of being held in a small fist. It opened on a hinge, and inside, pressed into the velvet backing meant for a photograph, was a small key. The kind used for a safe deposit box, flat and ridged, with a bank code stamped into the metal that had been partially scratched away but not entirely. She said, "Don't let anyone use it but her," Ivy said. She said only she knows where it goes. "She's right," Graves said. He didn't reach for it. "We're not going to use it without her. We're going to use it to get her out, and then she's going to use it herself." Ivy closed her fingers around the locket and looked down at it in her hand. "He took everything else from us," she said quietly. "Our house, her job, her name. She used to be different. She used to laugh more. Before she found out about the money. Before she started writing things down." Graves went very still. "She was writing things down." Ivy looked up. She said she found things at work, bad things. She started keeping them. She stopped, apparently working out whether she was supposed to say this, then deciding. She had a storage unit that nobody knew about, not even him. She said she put the important papers there. Do you know where it is? She shook her head. Just that it's in Spokane. She never told me where because she said it was safer if I didn't know. But she said the key, she looked at the locket, would get us in. Graves looked at the partial bank code on the key. A storage company, not a bank. The stamping was a registration code, not a financial institution routing mark. He'd seen similar keys before, rented storage facilities that used lockbox access instead of padlocks for premium units. Holloway, he said across the room. The man looked up from the laptop. Storage facility key, commercial rental, partial registration code. Graves held the locket across the space between them, steadying it in the low light. Can you find the facility from the partial? Holloway was already moving. It was 6:45 in the morning when everything changed. Ruiz and Garza came back from their pass by the Harrow residence, which was a property 12 miles outside Spokane on a private road. A compound rather than a house. Main building, guest quarters, what appeared to be a security office. The whole perimeter lit by motion-sensitive floods that Ruiz said came on twice while they were watching from the tree line. They'd counted vehicles. 4 SUVs in addition to the residential fleet. Men outside despite the cold walking a perimeter. He's staffed up, Ruiz said. He was compact, deliberate, the kind of man who watched more than he spoke and said things that mattered when he did speak. That's not household security. Those are people he brought in. When? Priest said. We can't know exactly. But the tire tracks in the driveway were fresh, post-blizzard fresh. So he knows she's alive, Cutter said. Nobody in the room said anything to the contrary. The shape of the thing they were in became sharper then. The comfortable uncertainty of maybe he thinks she died in the storm was gone, and what replaced it was clean and cold and less comfortable. Vincent Harrow knew the child had survived, and he had responded by bringing in people. And people meant a level of intent that went beyond what you needed to simply find a missing child through official channels. You called CPS through official channels. You called your lawyers through official channels. You brought in outside personnel to a secured compound when you were preparing for a different kind of problem. He can't go after her directly, Graves said, not without exposing why he wants her. Any noise he makes about her location has to be filtered through legitimate-sounding channels. So he reports her missing, Priest said. Does he? Priest checked his phone. He'd had a contact at Spokane PD keeping a quiet ear on dispatch. Not a cop on the Saints' payroll. Nothing as transactional as that. Just a man who owed Priest a favor from years ago and had so far been paying it in small, deniable installments. He typed a message and waited. The response came in 3 minutes. Amber Alert filed 0530. Ivy Cross, 7. Missing from family residence. Guardian listed as Vincent Harrow. Contact, Harrow Foundation Security Office. Cutter said something under his breath that wasn't a word. He filed at 5:30, Priest said. He's turned himself into the searching parent. Anyone we talk to who doesn't already know the real shape of this is going to see us as kidnappers. The room sat with that for a moment. The public defender, Graves said. Still waiting on a callback. How long do we have before somebody traces her here? Dutch asked. He'd woken up at some point during Ruiz and Garza's report, was standing now, the sleep gone from his face, replaced by the specific alertness of someone whose adrenal system has made a decision before their brain finished the briefing. We don't know, Holloway said. If he has someone in Spokane PD who runs the search actively, and they're good, they work outward from the last confirmed location, his compound, look for any traffic or witness contact during the blizzard, somebody at a gas station, a road camera. He paused. There's a camera at the I-90 on-ramp at Ritzville. Graves said, I came off 90 onto Trent. There are cameras on Trent. The silence that followed was productive in a different way than the earlier silences. This one had a clock in it. We need to move her, Cutter said. Not maybe. Now. Where? Dutch said. I've got a place, Boone said. My brother's hunting property, Colbert area. 40 acres, no through traffic. Nobody goes there in winter. No camera coverage between here and there if we take the right route. You trust your brother, Priest said. I trust him with my life. I trust him with a child's life. That's different. Priest looked around the room. Not asking for votes, he didn't operate that way. Reading the room, taking the temperature of the people in it, the way a good road captain did. Boone takes her in the van, he said. Now, Dutch goes with them. Graves. I stay, Graves said. Priest looked at him. You don't have to. I know. Harrow's people are already in motion. If this gets physical, Priest. Graves met his eyes. I stay. The road captain held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then he nodded once and moved on. They woke Ivy as gently as they could. Boone crouched beside her cot and spoke to her quietly, explaining in terms a 7-year-old could hold on to. New place. Safer. Better for a few days while they worked on getting her mom back. He did not lie to her, and he did not use the language of comfort that children know is not true. He spoke to her like she was someone who had already demonstrated she could handle reality, which she had. She listened. She looked at Graves. You're not coming, she said. Not right now. I've got something to do here first. She looked at him with those eyes. Then she held out the locket. Take it, she said. You need it more than I do. He looked at it in her small palm. That's your mother's. She gave it to me so it could help us. So take it and use it. A pause in which she appeared to do several years of calculation. Bring her home, she said, then give it back. He reached out and took the locket. It weighed almost nothing. She let Dutch lead her to the van without looking back, which was either a kind of trust or a kind of tactical decision, and it occurred to him that with Ivy Cross those two things might be the same. They left. The basement was quieter without her. The wood stove put out the same heat, but the room felt different, the way a room feels after someone essential to it has moved through and kept moving. Holloway said, Got it. Everyone moved to the laptop. The partial code from the key matched 3 commercial storage facilities in the Spokane area. Holloway had cross-referenced with rental records where they were public, filtered by rental duration. Celeste had been with the foundation for 8 years, so they were looking for a rental that old or older. And one facility came back with a record that fit. Eastside Secure Storage on East Sprague, a company that used keyed lockboxes for premium access. 8-year rental history on a unit in the premium tier, paid in annual lump sums from an account registered to a business name that had no other public footprint. She set up a shell account to pay for it, Holloway said. Small, simple, but deliberate. She didn't want it connected to her name. How long has she had this planned? Graves said. It wasn't entirely a question. Long enough, Priest said. Holloway pulled up the satellite view of the storage facility. Ordinary commercial property, single story, external access units, security gate, camera at the entrance. Standard, accessible. When do we go? Graves said. Daylight, Priest said. We go in daylight, civilian looking, one person with the key. In and out. That person is me, Graves said. I'm not on their radar the way you are. Harrow's people know the Saints are connected to this. They don't know me yet. They will, Cutter said. The camera on Trent Avenue. Maybe. But right now I'm a face without a name to them. That's a window. Priest thought about it. You go in. Holloway watches the perimeter from the street. If there's any presence at that facility that doesn't look like a person renting a unit, you turn around, you come back, we reassess. Understood. And Graves. Priest looked at him steadily. Whatever's in that unit, we do it right. We don't destroy it. We don't hold it. We don't use it for leverage. We document it, we copy it. We get it to someone who can actually put Harrow in front of a judge. Your public defender contact. If she calls back, yes. And if she doesn't, a pause. Priest's jaw worked slightly. Then we find another way. But we do it right. Because if we do it wrong, we hand Harrow the one thing he needs to make Celeste look like a liar and a criminal, and us look like the story he's already telling about us. Graves held his gaze. I know, he said. I know. It was 7:45 in the morning when Priest's phone rang. Not the public defender, the contact at Spokane PD. The message was 3 words long, and Priest read it, and his expression did something that Graves had not seen on his face in 3 years of knowing him. What? Graves said. Priest turned the phone around. The message read, Detective on your case, not ours, FBI. The room went completely silent. Holloway said, Someone filed federally before us. Harrow? Cutter said immediately. Or, Priest said, and stopped. Or what? Graves said. Or someone inside Cascadia View has been feeding information out for longer than we knew about. He set the phone down carefully on the table, which means there's a federal investigation already in motion, which means there's a possibility this has been building towards something. Or, Graves said, and the cold in his voice was not anger, it was the kind of clarity that comes at a certain temperature, it means Harrow has federal contacts and he's turned this into a kidnapping investigation with us as the subjects before we've even left the building. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it, because both of those things were true. Both of them were possible. And there was no way from inside this basement to know which one it was. And that meant every move they made next. The storage unit, the locket, the files, the woman 31 years old in a facility 40 miles east. Every single move existed inside a space where they could not trust the ground beneath their feet. Cutter put his hands flat on the table and looked at Priest. We walk out that door, he said, and we're either walking into a federal investigation that ends Harrow, or we're walking into one that ends us. Yes, Priest said. How do we know which? We don't? Not yet. Graves picked up the locket from the table where he'd set it. He held it in his palm, the small, worn silver heart, the key inside it pressing against his skin through the metal. A woman, 31 years old, had spent years building a case that could burn down a powerful man's empire. She had done it alone, in secret, while working inside his organization, while raising a daughter alone, while understanding that the moment he found out, she was finished. She had stayed anyway. Not because she had a death wish, because she understood that the only thing more dangerous than acting was not acting, that the machine only stopped if someone was willing to step into it. She had been taken, her daughter had been beaten and thrown into a storm, and she had been right about all of it. We go, Graves said. His voice was level. He looked at Priest. You know we go. The question was never whether. Priest looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to the room. Gear up, he said. We move in 30 minutes. If the FBI is already in this, then we either get to that storage unit first, or we lose the only thing that can tell us whose side they're. They went in 2 vehicles. Holloway drove the lead car, a 10-year-old Civic, gray, nothing memorable, with Graves in the passenger seat and the locket in Graves's inside jacket pocket pressing against his sternum like a small cold coal. Priest followed 2 minutes behind in a different vehicle, different route, because splitting the approach was the kind of basic tradecraft that you learned either from training or from surviving the consequences of not doing it, and everyone in this chapter had done one or the other. The city was quiet in the way cities are quiet on Christmas morning. Not empty, but subdued, moving at half speed, the streets salted and sanded from the overnight plows, the sky a flat white that wasn't threatening more snow so much as it was withholding the decision. They drove east on Sprague through neighborhoods that were doing their best impression of ordinary. Lights in windows, the occasional car warming up in a driveway, a dog standing at a fence line watching them pass with the alert indifference of an animal that had no stake in whatever they were carrying. Graves didn't speak. Holloway didn't either. The radio was off. The heater ran on low, the fan noise a steady white background against which the sound of the tires on wet asphalt registered as something almost meditative. He turned the key over in his mind without touching it. Celeste Cross, 31 years old, 8 years inside the Harrow Foundation, watching, documenting, staying quiet until she couldn't anymore. He'd known people like her before, not many, but enough to recognize the pattern. People who absorbed a wrong thing and instead of exploding outward, went inward, went methodical, went patient. The dangerous kind of righteous. The kind that built cases in secret storage units and gave their 7-year-old daughters contingency keys and told them what to do if everything fell apart. The kind that got locked away by men who understood exactly how dangerous patience was. East Side Secure Storage came up on the right, a long, low building behind a chain-link gate. The exterior units facing an asphalt access road that ran the perimeter. The gate was electronic, key fob operated. There was a camera above it. Holloway drove past without slowing, looped the block, came up the parallel street and parked with a sightline to the entrance. One camera at the gate, Graves said. I saw 2 more on the corner units. Interior might have more. Management office is closed, Holloway said. Christmas. No staff. Security monitoring could be remote. Probably is. Holloway paused. Doesn't matter if the footage goes somewhere we can't control, because we're not doing anything illegal. She gave us the key. A 7-year-old gave us the key. Her mother gave it to her, and her mother has legal standing over the unit. The rental is hers. Holloway looked at him. Don't overthink the legal architecture right now. Get in, get out, get what's there. Graves studied the entrance. No vehicles on the access road, no idling cars on the surrounding street. The area was quiet, and the quiet felt real rather than constructed, which was the best read available on short notice, and he knew better than to treat it as certainty. He got out of the car. The fob built into the locket's chain. He'd found it only when he'd looked closely. A small, gray plastic disc that had been threaded onto the chain alongside the locket itself, nearly invisible against the silver, opened the gate on the first press. The gate swung inward with the electric whir of a mechanism that got exercised regularly, and he walked through. Unit 114 was in the back row, premium tier, one of the larger units. The key went into the lockbox on the roll-up door, and the lockbox opened, and inside it was a padlock hasp, and the same key fit that too. He pulled the roll-up door, and it went up on well-maintained tracks with a sound like a quick intake of breath. He stood in the threshold and looked at what Celeste Cross had built. It was not a large unit, maybe 10 by 12, but it was organized with the precision of someone who had understood that the organization itself might someday matter as much as the contents. Metal shelving along both walls, the shelves holding archival document boxes, each one labeled in a small, clear hand, dates, categories, what appeared to be file codes. A laptop in a waterproof case on the center shelf, a portable hard drive in a padded sleeve beside it, and on the bottom shelf, in a fireproof document box, a thick accordion folder with a rubber band around it and a single word written on the tab in the same small, clear hand. Proof. He stood there for 3 seconds looking at it. Just 3 seconds, feeling the weight of what 8 years of someone's life in secret looked like when it was given physical form. Then he picked up the accordion folder, the hard drive, the laptop case, and he walked back out into the cold Christmas morning and pulled the door down behind him and locked it and walked back through the gate and got in the car. Holloway looked at what he was carrying and said nothing. They drove. Priest's voice came through on the phone that Holloway had set in the cup holder, speaker on, the line they'd kept open. Clean? Clean, Holloway said. Come back the long way, 20 minutes. They came back the long way, 20 minutes through the quiet Christmas streets, Graves with the accordion folder on his lap and his hand flat on top of it and his eyes on the road outside. He thought about a 31-year-old woman who had assembled this alone, who had gone to work every day inside the organization of the man who was building toward destroying her, and had smiled in meetings and attended galas and directed community programs and put her daughter to bed at night, and had found time in the gaps between all of that to document everything, to build a case piece by careful piece, because she had understood that anger wasn't enough and good intentions weren't enough, and the only thing that worked against a man like Harrow was evidence. He thought about Ivy saying she used to laugh more. He thought about the belt marks on the child's back. He did not say any of this. He held the folder and he watched the road. Back in the basement, they laid everything out on the folding table. Priest opened the accordion folder first, working through it methodically, not rushing. The discipline of a man who understood that the order of discovery mattered. Cutter stood at his shoulder. Graves stood across the table. Holloway had the laptop case open and was working on a bypass for the password, which he said would take less time than it sounded like. The accordion folder contained 8 years of Vincent Harrow. Bank records, not his public accounts, but transfers from subsidiary entities to other subsidiary entities, money moving through a chain of companies in amounts that correlated with specific dates. Holloway, when he saw the first page, said quietly, "That's not business expense. Those are payments." Contracts with signatures, some bearing what appeared to be judicial seals. Photographs, taken with a long lens, from distance, the kind of photographs that required either professional equipment or a very steady hand and a lot of patience. Harrow with men whose names Graves didn't recognize. Harrow with a man whose name he recognized from Holloway's board research, Gerald Strauss, the co-director of the Institute. Harrow with a man in a dark suit whose face was partially turned away from the camera, but whose posture and whose hand on Harrow's arm conveyed a specific kind of authority. "Who's the third man?" Graves said. Nobody answered immediately. Priest held the photograph under the bare bulb light, tilting it slightly. "I don't know," he said. "Can we enhance it?" "Holloway." Holloway took the photograph without looking up from the laptop, held it next to his screen, typed something. "Give me a few minutes." There was a handwritten journal in the folder. Small format, the pages dense with Celeste's clear script, entries dated across a span of 4 years. Priest read from it without reading it aloud, his face doing the thing faces do when they're absorbing information that alters the shape of what they thought they understood. He read for 10 minutes without stopping. When he looked up, his expression had settled into something very still. "She wasn't just documenting financial crimes," he said. "What was she documenting?" Graves said. "The Institute." Priest set the journal down carefully. "Cascadia View. Harrow has been using it for years. Celeste found the first transfer record 6 years ago. Payments from Harrow to the management company that runs it. She started tracking admissions. Cross-referencing." He paused. "There are at least 9 people in that facility who had prior connections to Harrow or his associates. Business disputes. Contractual conflicts. A woman who filed a workplace harassment complaint against one of Harrow's executives." A pause. "A journalist who was working on an investigative piece about the Foundation's financials." The room was completely still. "He uses it as a disposal mechanism," Graves said. "That's what she concluded." "Voluntary commitments," Cutter said. His voice was very flat. "Signed off by a judge. Once you're inside, you're a patient. Your credibility is compromised by definition. Anything you say can be characterized as a symptom." "And if the facility is his," Holloway said from the laptop without looking up, "then the treating physicians are his, the records are his, the medication regime is his. You can keep someone sedated and compliant indefinitely and document it as treatment." The silence that settled after that was a different kind of silence from any that had come before. This one had a mass to it, the physical weight of understanding something that cannot be unknown once understood. Graves looked at the journal on the table, at the 8 years of someone's life in a folder, at the laptop that Holloway had just unlocked, the screen coming alive with file directories, hundreds of them, organized with the same methodical clarity as the physical files. "She knew exactly what she was doing," he said. "It was not a question." "She knew exactly what she was doing," Priest said. "And he found out. He must have. Or got close enough to finding out that acting was safer than waiting." Priest looked at the journal again. "The last entry is dated 11 days before she walked into that gas station. What does it say?" Priest opened the journal to the last page and read. His expression didn't change while he read, which meant he was managing it deliberately. He closed the journal. "It says she thinks someone in her office has been going through her computer. It says she's going to move the most important files to the storage unit that weekend. And it says—" He stopped. "What?" "It says she's afraid for Ivy." Graves put both hands flat on the table. The surface was cold under his palms, the metal folding table conducting the basement's chill upward through his hands and into his arms. And he felt it as something clarifying, the cold as a fact that demanded acknowledgement. "How fast can you copy everything on that laptop?" he said to Holloway. "With the drive I have? Maybe 40 minutes for the full directory." "Start now." He walked to the far end of the basement, not for privacy. There were no private thoughts happening in this room that everyone else wasn't having too, but for the 3 seconds of movement that let him recalibrate. He stood with his back to the room and looked at the concrete wall and breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The field technique for getting your heart rate under control when your heart rate had an opinion about the situation. Then he turned around, because the wall wasn't going to tell him anything he didn't already know. Priest was on his phone, talking low and fast. The callback. The federal public defender. She'd called back during the storage unit run. Graves could hear the one-sided conversation, Priest's voice precise and uninflected, a man laying out facts for someone who needed facts rather than emotion, which was the right call, which was why Priest was road captain and Graves had ridden alone for 3 years. The call lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, Priest stood holding the phone for a moment before he lowered it. "She's coming," he said. "When?" Cutter said. Hour and a half. Maybe 2. What did you tell her? Enough. He looked at the table, at the evidence of 8 years of one woman's courage spread out under a bare bulb in a basement. She already knew about Harrow, not this specifically, but she'd heard things. She said, a pause. She said she'd been waiting for someone to bring her something she could actually use. Graves thought about that. He thought about a federal public defender who had been waiting for someone to bring her something she could use on Vincent Harrow. He thought about what that waiting looked like from the inside. Watching the machine run, knowing it was wrong, not having the evidence to stop it, moving through a system that was supposed to correct itself and watching it not correct itself. He thought about how that was different from Celeste Cross in a storage unit at night, photographing documents with a long lens, and he thought about how it was exactly the same. Ruiz, he said. Ruiz looked up from the corner where he'd been sitting with his phone, monitoring the scanner app he ran on his off-network device. Anything on the Amber Alert? It's live. Spokane PD, State Patrol, Regional. Description matches Ivy. He paused. They're describing the person of interest as a white male, approximately 50, riding a motorcycle. Graves looked at Priest. They had the camera footage already, Priest said. He has someone inside. At what level? Fast enough to have the description in a public alert by 9 on Christmas morning. That's not a desk officer. Priest's voice was measured. That's someone with direct access. Holloway said, that might be our FBI problem. If Harrow has a contact at the field office, then the federal investigation that's supposedly in motion could be pointing at us, Cutter finished. Not at him. The cold of that reality settled through the room like the cold in the windows, steady and thorough. Ruiz held up one hand. His attention was on the scanner. There's something else, he said. Hold on. He listened for another 10 seconds. His face changed. There's a call on the county frequency. Welfare check request, Cascadia View Institute. Nobody moved. Someone from the Institute called for a welfare check, Ruiz said slowly, on staff. They're saying a staff member failed to report for shift, failed to answer calls, and the last contact was last night. Name, Priest said. Ruiz listened. Davies, Gerald Davies, listed as a nurse practitioner. Holloway was typing immediately. His fingers stopped. Gerald Davies, he said, and his voice had changed, gone flat in the specific way voices go flat when the information they're carrying is too heavy for the ordinary register. He's in the system. Licensed NP, Cascadia View for 4 years, he paused. And he's on a list. What list? Graves said. Celeste's files. Holloway turned the laptop screen. On it was a spreadsheet, one of hundreds in the directory, but this one was open, the entries visible across the room. Names, dates, a column of what appeared to be dosage notations. Gerald Davies appeared 11 times in 18 months. He's one of her witnesses, Holloway said. She was building a case against him specifically, over-medicating patients, falsifying treatment records. She documented him, Graves said. He's in the journal too, Priest said. He had the journal open again, moving backward through the pages. She writes about him 3 times. She was afraid of him. He found a passage. She writes, Davies knows I've been asking questions. He looked at me differently today, like he was calculating something. Graves said, he's the one who found out. The room reassembled itself around that conclusion. Davies had known. Davies had told Harrow, or had told someone who had told Harrow, and that had been the beginning of the end for Celeste Cross. The emergency psychiatric hold, the judge, the transfer. All of it had been set in motion by one man who looked at a woman differently one day and recognized her as a threat. And now Davies had missed his shift. He ran, Dutch said from the cot area. He'd come back sometime during the storage unit run, had come in quiet and positioned himself against the wall near the staircase with the particular stillness of a large man who has learned to disappear. Maybe, Priest said. Or he was told to disappear, Graves said. By Harrow. He's a liability now. Celeste was documenting him specifically. If she had recordings, if she had... Graves stopped. Check the hard drive. Check for audio files. Holloway switched to the hard drive directory without being asked. He scanned. He stopped scanning. There are 43 audio files, he said. The oldest is dated 3 years ago. The most recent is dated, he checked, 4 days before her hospitalization. Nobody said anything for a moment. She recorded him, Graves said. It came out quieter than he intended. Celeste recorded Davies. She had 3 years of recordings. Which means Davies knows she recorded him, Cutter said. Because Harrow knows. And Harrow would have told Davies because Davies' exposure is Harrow's leverage over him. And a man who knows he's on 43 audio recordings doesn't just miss a shift, Priest said. He either runs, Graves said, or he's already been... The sound of something hitting the metal door at the top of the stairs stopped him mid-sentence. Not a knock. A knock had a human pattern, a deliberate rhythm. This was different. A single heavy impact, the sound of something thrown, or the sound of someone falling, followed by nothing. Every person in the room moved at the same time. The movement synchronized by experience rather than coordination. Everyone finding the positions they needed without discussion. Cutter to the left of the staircase base, Ruiz to the right, Priest at the table with the evidence, Holloway closing the laptop. Dutch's hand went to his back and came back empty. No weapon, because Dutch didn't carry, one of the things about him that was still evolving. And he moved to the far wall without being told. Graves went up the stairs. He went fast and quiet, staying to the right side of the stairs where the treads were less likely to creak. His right hand forward, his whole body oriented upward in the posture of someone who has made entries before and understands the geometry of what's on the other side of a door. He reached the door. No sound from outside. He pressed his ear to the metal and heard wind, the hiss of something moving along the ground, then nothing. He opened the door. The man on the ground outside was not one of Harrow's people. He was in his 40s, wearing scrubs under an unzipped winter coat, the coat dark with what was either water or blood, and in the gray Christmas morning light it was impossible to tell immediately which. He was conscious, barely. His eyes were open and tracking, but the tracking was slow. The delayed visual focus of someone operating through significant pain or shock, or both. On his chest, placed there deliberately by someone or clutched there by the man himself, was a manila envelope. Graves crouched. "Who are you?" The man's mouth moved. He swallowed, tried again. "Davies," he said. The name hit Graves like something physical. He processed it in the half-second he allowed himself for processing, then moved forward into assessment. He scanned the perimeter, the parking lot, the fence line, the street beyond. Empty. Or appearing empty, which was not the same thing, and he treated it accordingly. He reached down and got his hands under Davies' arms and dragged him through the door and down the stairs, which was not graceful, and Davies made sounds on the stairs that suggested the process was not comfortable, but comfortable was not the metric being applied. At the bottom of the stairs, Boone appeared from somewhere and took over with the efficiency of someone returning to his primary competence, and Graves stepped back and let him work. Davies was beaten. Methodically, the way a person gets beaten who is being beaten by someone who knows how to do it without creating visible marks in the immediately obvious places. Bruising on the torso, the ribs, the lower back. A laceration on his hairline that had bled significantly and produced the blood-on-coat situation that had read as possibly water from a distance. His right hand was wrong at the wrist, either fractured or dislocated. Boone said, "He needs a hospital." "He needs to talk first," Graves said. Boone looked at him. I know what he needs. I know." Graves crouched in front of Davies, who was propped against the wall with his legs out and his good hand holding the manila envelope against his chest. Gerald Davies, I need you to stay with me for 10 minutes. Can you do that?" Davies looked at him. His eyes were clearer than they had any right to be, given the evidence on his body. Something in them that was past fear and into the further territory. The territory where someone has already accepted the worst-case scenario and is now operating without the drag of hope, distorting their judgment. "Harrow's men," Davies said. "They came to my apartment this morning, before dawn." Each sentence cost something. He was spending carefully. "I got out through the fire escape. He lifted the envelope slightly. "Had this ready. I've had it ready for 6 months." "What's in it?" Graves said. Davies looked at him for a moment. The assessment of a man who is deciding how much to trust a stranger and has very little time to make the decision. "My copy," he said. "I didn't just know about Celeste Cross documenting me. I was documenting too." He stopped to breathe, 3 measured breaths. "I was documenting Harrow. I had access to the Institute's internal records. Celeste didn't know, but we were building the same case from opposite sides. A pause. I tried to get out 6 months ago. He found out I was talking to someone. He put me back. His jaw tightened. The man in the photograph. The one you can't see clearly. Graves stilled. Holloway appeared at his shoulder without a sound. In his hand was a printed still from the photograph. The enhancement he'd been working on before the storage run, the image clarified enough now to show a face. Davies looked at the photograph. "That's him," he said. Graves looked at the photograph. The face was late 50s, heavy through the jaw, silver-haired, with the kind of formal grooming that indicated institutional authority. Not the groomed authority of money like Harrow, but the different grooming of office, of appointment, of someone whose appearance was a function of their position rather than their preference. He had seen that face before, and it took him 3 seconds to place it because the context was wrong. The man belonged to a different kind of room than the one Graves was in, and his brain was sorting through its files at the speed that shock permitted. Then he placed it. "That's Special Agent in Charge Raymond Holt," Holloway said from directly behind him, his voice very quiet. "FBI Seattle Field Office. He oversees the Eastern Washington District." The room did not make a sound. Graves looked at the photograph, at the man's hand on Harrow's arm, not the hand of a law enforcement official maintaining professional distance from a person of interest, the hand of someone in business with someone, the hand of a partner. "The federal investigation," Graves said slowly, "is his," Priest said from across the room. He had been still throughout all of this, standing at the table, and now his stillness had a different quality. The stillness of a man who has just understood that the ground he thought he was standing on was not the ground. "The FBI investigation into Harrow's operation," Graves said. "Holt controls it, which means it's not an investigation into Harrow. It's a cleanup operation," Cutter said. "It's a mechanism to find what Celeste built and destroy it and bury the people who helped her," Graves said. "That's what we walked into this morning. That's what that Amber Alert is. That's what the description of a white male on a motorcycle is." He looked at Priest. "They're not looking for Ivy to protect her. They're looking for Ivy to find what she's carrying," Davies said from the floor, with the deliberate economy of a man who is very carefully spending his last reserves. "There's more." His eyes moved from Graves to Priest to the envelope on his chest. "I need you to promise me something before I tell you." Priest stepped forward. He crouched in front of Davies at Graves's level. "Tell me what you need." "There's a woman at the Institute," Davies said. "Not Celeste. Different. She's been there 3 years. She came in the same way. Voluntary commitment signed by Weil, transferred from a conflict with a Harrow associate. Her name is Esperanza Ruiz." He watched the room and saw the name land on Ruiz against the wall. "No relation," he said, acknowledging the coincidence. "She's 44. She's from Yakima. She's been sedated and held for 3 years, and she's still—" His voice fractured slightly, controlled it. "She's still in there. There are others, but she's the one I know. I know she's still coherent enough. If you're going in for Celeste, I need you to take her out too." Priest held Davies's gaze. "We'll bring her out. Both of them. Both of them." Davies let his eyes close for 1 second. 1 second of relief, and then open again because he wasn't finished. "What I have in this envelope, it's the same as what Celeste built, but there's one thing in mine that isn't in hers. Holt's name is in my records. 3 meetings, documented, dates and locations, and what was discussed." He paused. "I was there. I took notes in the bathroom. I can testify." The silence that settled over the room after that was absolute. Not the silence of shock. The silence of people rearranging everything they thought they understood about the dimensions of the thing they were inside. Harrow and a sitting FBI special agent in charge. A judicial system that signed orders on 3-hour notice. A private institution used to imprison witnesses and inconvenient people. An Amber Alert weaponized against the people trying to help the child it claimed to be protecting. "We can't go to the FBI," Dutch said quietly. It wasn't a question. "We can't go to local law enforcement," Ruiz said. "We can't go anywhere that feeds into the system Harrow has occupied," Holloway said, "which is—" He stopped. Let the room finish it, which was most of it. Priest stood up. He stood in the center of the room, under the bare bulb, with the evidence of 8 years of Celeste Cross's work on the table behind him and the beaten body of the man who had spent 6 months building his own parallel case against the wall beside him, and he looked at the men in the room one at a time. He looked at Graves last. "The public defender," Graves said. "She's the only channel we have that doesn't route through something Harrow controls," Priest said. "She works federal defense, which means she has standing to go to the DOJ Inspector General's office if she has evidence of FBI corruption. That's a different chain. That's outside Holt's district authority." "How long does that take?" Cutter said. "I don't know, because Celeste Cross is in that facility right now," Cutter said, "being medicated by people who work for the man we're trying to expose. And the woman Davies just named, and however many others." He looked at Priest steadily. "We go to the public defender and wait for the DOJ to move, and it takes weeks. It takes days. Those people are at risk of disappearing further, being moved, being—" He stopped himself from finishing. The room understood what he'd stopped himself from finishing. "There's a window," Graves said. He heard his own voice come out from somewhere very still, the flat effect of a man who has reduced the problem to its geometry and is looking at the geometry. Harrow's focus is on finding the evidence. The storage unit, the locket, what Ivy was carrying. As long as he doesn't know we have it, as long as he thinks it's still out there somewhere, he's in motion, moving resources toward finding it. He paused. The moment he realizes we have it and it's already in other hands, his calculation changes. He shifts from find and destroy to damage control. And damage control for him might mean making sure the witnesses in that facility can't testify, Boone said. Yes. The room was very quiet for a moment. "So the window is now," Priest said, "before he knows what we have." "The window closes," Graves said, "the second that public defender walks in here and makes a call that goes anywhere near a system Harrow can monitor." He looked at Priest. "She needs to receive everything we have and go somewhere he can't see before she moves. And while she does that, we go to Cascadia View," Priest said. Not a question. Not a plan being proposed. A statement of what was already true had been true since the moment Davies said there are others, since the moment Celeste Cross had walked into a gas station in a hospital gown, since before any of that, since the moment a child was put barefoot into a blizzard and the only person who stopped was a man on a motorcycle who recognized a certain look in a pair of dark eyes. Cutter said, "If we do this, we are no longer the people who found a child and reported it and cooperated with authorities. We are the people who took action against a facility and removed patients, and by the standards of every legal framework we will be—" "I know what we'll be," Priest said. Cutter held his gaze. "Do you?" "I know exactly what we'll be." Priest looked at each face in the room. "Anybody who wants to walk, walk now. I mean that. Walk now, and I will never hold it against you, and your name doesn't appear in any of this." Nobody walked. Nobody moved at all. Boone said quietly from the floor beside Davies, "Somebody's going to need to set this risk before we go anywhere." He looked up, and there was something in his face that was not quite a smile but was in the territory. The expression of a man who has found, after a long search, the thing he was built for. "And then I need someone to tell me everything you know about the layout of—" Boone set Davies' wrist in 11 minutes. Davies made one sound during the process, a single sharp exhale through clenched teeth, and then nothing. The kind of pain tolerance that came not from toughness, but from having already calibrated what mattered and what didn't, and deciding that the wrist didn't. While Boone worked, Priest laid out the approach on the table using a hand-drawn map that Holloway produced from memory. Holloway had driven past Cascadia View twice in the 17 days since Celeste's disappearance. The systematic reconnaissance of a man who understood that information gathered before you need it is always worth more than information gathered after. The facility sat on 40 acres of mountain property east of the city, a main building of 3 floors, 2 secondary structures, a service road in from the highway, and a secondary maintenance track around the eastern perimeter that wasn't on the public maps but showed on satellite imagery as a cleared line through the tree cover. The public defender arrived at 11:47. Her name was Okafor. She was 40, compact, wearing civilian clothes that still managed to read as professional, and she walked into the basement and looked at the table covered in 8 years of Celeste Cross's evidence, and Gerald Davies propped against the wall with a splinted wrist, and she did not say anything for a full 10 seconds. Then she said, I need 2 hours with this material. You have one, Priest said. 2. We don't have 2. She looked at him. Then give me one and understand that what I can do with 1 hour is less than what I can do with 2. 1 hour, Priest said. And then we need you out of this building and somewhere Holt can't find you before you make any calls. She looked at the name. She knew the name. Her expression when she heard it was the expression of someone having a private conversation with something they'd suspected for a long time. Understood, she said, and sat down and began to work. They left her to it. Graves went upstairs one more time, into the cold that had softened slightly in the midday, the temperature climbing toward 25 degrees, still brutal but no longer the edge of survival cold of the night before. He called Boone's phone. Dutch had it, out at the hunting property. And when Dutch answered, he said, "How is she?" "Sleeping," Dutch said. "She ate. She asked about you." "What did you tell her?" "That you were working on it." A pause. The wind moved through the gap between the factory wall and the fence, carrying the smell of wet concrete and exhaust from the highway. "Tell her—" He stopped. "I'll tell her," Dutch said. Didn't ask what, just understood that some things didn't need to be said in full to be delivered whole. He ended the call and went back down. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Okafor looked up from the table and said, "This is enough." Her voice was very steady. "This is more than enough. What Celeste Cross built, combined with Davies' documentation of Holt, this is federal prosecution material. This is multi-defendant, multi-count. This is the kind of case that ends careers and ends freedom and does not come apart on appeal." She paused. "I need to make one call from a location that isn't here. I need to reach the DOJ Inspector General's duty officer directly, not through the field office, directly. And I need to have copies of the key documents with me when I do it." "Holloway's made copies," Priest said. "Then I'm ready." She looked at the room. "What are you going to do?" Priest said, "What needs doing?" She looked at him for a moment. Something moved through her face that was not approval exactly, but was adjacent to it. The recognition of a person who understood what was at stake and had stopped requiring the people willing to act on it to look like the people she usually worked with. "Don't get anyone killed," she said. "Working on it," Priest said. She left with Ruiz driving and 2 copies of the most critical documents in a waterproof bag, and the basement became a different room after she walked out of it. Smaller, colder, stripped of the possibility of any outcome that didn't involve the Iron Saints driving 40 miles east into the mountains on Christmas afternoon. They went in 4 vehicles, staggered by 5-minute intervals on different routes, converging at a pull-off on the state highway 2 miles from the Cascadia View access road. Graves rode the Road King. The cold hit him full in the face as he came out of the city's shelter, and the mountain wind found him. The kind of wind that knew where to find the gaps in leather and flannel and worked them without apology. He rode toward it. The pull-off was a gravel turnout used by hunters in season, empty now, the gravel crusted with ice under a thin scrape of afternoon snow. They assembled in the cold without ceremony. 6 men, 2 vehicles, the Road King, and the specific silence of people who have made their decision and are now on the other side of it where talking doesn't accomplish anything that moving won't accomplish better. Cutter had the layout committed to memory. He walked them through it once, standing in the cold with his breath clouding in short, controlled puffs. Main entrance was out, staffed, camera covered, the kind of access point that generated a record and gave Harrow time to respond. The maintenance track on the eastern perimeter came in behind the secondary structure, which Davies had confirmed was the residential wing. Ground floor, east side, 4 rooms assigned to what the internal documentation listed as long-term residents, the institutional language for people who were not there voluntarily and were not expected to leave. Davies had given them 2 things before they left. A staff access code that was either still valid or had been changed in the last 12 hours, and a room number, room 112, east wing, ground floor, second door from the maintenance entrance, Celeste Cross, room 112. "If the code's burned," Graves said. "Then we go through the door a different way," Cutter said. "Davies said she'd be medicated." "Boone handles that." Boone nodded once. He had a kit. He knew what to reverse, and how fast, and what the risks were, and he had accepted the risks on behalf of the people who couldn't consent to them because they were in room 112. Esperanza Ruiz, Graves said. He looked at the man named Ruiz, who had been quiet since Davies said the name, the contained quiet of someone managing something large in a small container. Davies said 114, Ruiz said. I've got it. You don't know this woman, Graves said. Not a challenge, just making sure. Doesn't matter, Ruiz said, and the simplicity of it, the absolute unfussy certainty of it, closed the question. They moved at 3:47 in the afternoon, the light already going thin and gray in the mountains, the fir trees on both sides of the maintenance track pressing close, their snow-loaded branches hanging low enough to brush the roof of the lead vehicle as it pushed through. Graves came in last on the bike, the engine throttled down to a low burble that still sounded enormous in the mountain quiet, and which he accepted as a fact he couldn't change. The maintenance entrance was a steel door and a concrete block wall, institutional gray, no handle on the outside, access code keypad only, the kind that beeped confirmation or denial with the bland efficiency of a system that had no investment in the outcome. Cutter punched the code. The keypad beeped green. The door opened. The smell that came out was institutional, antiseptic, recycled air, the particular quality of a building that had been sealed against winter for months and had been breathing itself. Graves knew that smell. He'd been in places that smelled like that before, in different countries, in different contexts, and the smell was always the same because the thing the smell indicated was always the same, the engineering of control. They moved in fast and quiet, Cutter at point, Boone close behind, Graves third, the others distributing behind them with the automatic spacing of people who had done entries before. The corridor was linoleum over concrete, overhead fluorescence on a night cycle dimmer, the light low and greenish and throwing long shadows from the door frames. Room 112. Cutter tried the handle. Locked. He looked at Graves. Graves hit it once with his shoulder, the way you hit a hollow core institutional door. Not the movie version, not a flying kick, just the precise application of body weight to the point of weakest resistance, and the frame gave and the door opened and they went in. The woman on the bed was 31 years old. She looked older. That was the medication. It aged people. The specific combination that sedated without quite incapacitating, kept you compliant without keeping you entirely absent, because entirely absent was harder to document as voluntary. She was small, dark-haired, and she had Ivy's eyes, or Ivy had hers, the same large dark eyes that in this face were open and unfocused and trying, visibly trying, to process the information arriving in them. Boone was at the bed before Graves had finished processing the room. He was already talking to her. Low, steady, clinical, without being cold. Celeste, my name is Boone. I'm a medic. I'm going to check your vitals, and I'm going to give you something that's going to help you wake up. Can you hear me? Her lips moved. Ivy, she said. Her voice was blurred, the consonants soft from disuse and medication. Ivy. Ivy is safe, Graves said. He was across the room before he decided to cross it, crouching at the bedside, putting himself in her sightline. She's safe. She's warm. She's waiting for you. Celeste Cross looked at him. Her eyes moved over his face with the slow deliberation of someone reading through water, trying to bring him into focus. Who? She said. My name is Ryder. I found her in the storm. Something moved through her face, the first real movement, the first thing that was hers rather than the medications. A convulsion of emotion that she didn't have the motor control to complete, that started as something and arrived at tears without passing through any of the intermediate expressions. She had the locket, Graves said. He reached into his jacket and took it out and placed it in her hand, the small, worn silver heart, and her fingers closed around it with the reflex of a body that had been waiting for that specific shape. From down the corridor came the sound of a door and then Ruiz's voice. One word. Clear. Then, from further away, from the direction of the main building, from the direction of the staffed entrance and the security office and the infrastructure of the place that was supposed to be keeping these people, the sound of an alarm. Not loud, not the screaming alarm of a fire system, the lower, steadier tone of a security alert. Someone had seen something on a camera. Someone had pushed a button, Boone said, without looking up from Celeste's arm where he was working the IV line. We have about 4 minutes before someone gets here from the main building. 3, Cutter said from the doorway, where he was watching the corridor in both directions with the focus of a man who has compressed his entire operating capacity into a single corridor and a single clock. Graves looked at Celeste, at the IV line coming out of her arm, at the medication that had been maintaining her compliance for 17 days, which Boone was now working to counteract with the focused urgency of someone who understood the chemistry and was running the numbers in real time. "Can she walk?" he said. "She will," Boone said. It was not a prediction. It was a declaration of intent, the specific kind that meant he was going to do whatever it took to make it true in the time available. Celeste's grip on the locket tightened. Her eyes found Graves again, clearer now, a degree of focus returning to them that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. And in those eyes he saw something that he recognized because he had seen it on a highway, in a blizzard, in a set of much smaller eyes. The look of someone who has been waiting for the least bad option and has just decided that this is it. "I can walk," she said. Her voice was still soft, but it was hers now. "I've been waiting to walk out of here for 17 days. The alarm continued its low, steady tone down the corridor. Outside, through the single-barred window above the bed, came a sound that Graves had been listening for without consciously knowing he'd been listening for it. The approach of engines on the access road. Multiple engines. The heavy, purposeful engine note of vehicles being driven fast on a private road by people who had been told to get somewhere and had accepted the instruction without asking what happened when they arrived. Harrow's people. Not facility staff. The outside personnel that Ruiz and Garza had counted at the compound, 4 SUVs, men walking a perimeter in the cold, they had been redirected. Someone had flagged the maintenance track entry. Someone had been watching. Cutter said from the doorway, very calm, "We've got company coming in from the east." Graves stood up. He looked at Boone. "How long?" Boone had the IV line out and was already helping Celeste to sitting position, one hand at her back, talking her through it. "She's up in 30 seconds or she's up in 2 minutes. I can't tell you which yet." 30 seconds, Graves said. He looked at the door. He looked at the corridor and the exit and the maintenance track where the Road King was parked and the 4 SUVs closing the distance from the east. He thought about a little girl with a granola bar in her hand and ancient eyes who had said, "Bring her home," with the straightforward authority of someone who had never fully stopped believing it was possible. He took a breath. Then he walked to the doorway and looked at Cutter and said the only thing left to say, "Tell everyone we're coming out hot," and moved back into the room to help carry. They came out hot. Graves had Celeste's left arm across his shoulders, her weight against his side, her feet finding the linoleum with the tentative rediscovery of a body, remembering that it knew how to do this. Boone had her right side. She was moving, not smoothly, not fast, but moving with the intent of someone who had decided that nothing in her body's current state of compromise was going to be the thing that stopped her. The corridor was 30 feet to the maintenance door. They covered it in the time it took the alarm to cycle twice. Outside, the cold hit Celeste like a physical fact, and she gasped. Not pain, Graves thought, but reality, the shock of air that hadn't been filtered and recycled and made compliant, real air with real teeth. And her grip on his jacket tightened, and she kept moving. The maintenance track was chaos organized by men who had done chaotic things before. Cutter and Ruiz had Esperanza, a small, gray-haired woman of 44 who walked with the rigid dignity of someone refusing to be carried regardless of what her legs were doing, between them, moving toward the second vehicle. The first SUV was already running, Garza behind the wheel, the doors open. The eastern perimeter showed headlights through the tree line, 2 sets, moving fast on the maintenance track from the opposite direction, and the distance was closing. Graves got Celeste to the vehicle. He got her door open and got her inside, and she turned and looked at him through the door frame with those eyes, clearer now than they'd been in the room, the medication losing its grip in the cold air, and she said, "The files. Okafor has them." "She has them. She's already made the call." Something in Celeste's face completed itself. A tension that had been resident there so long it had become structural, finally releasing, the way a body releases when it puts down a weight. It's been carrying so long it forgot the weight wasn't part of itself. "Go," Graves said. Garza went. The vehicle fishtailed slightly on the ice of the maintenance track, and then caught and accelerated into the tree line, and Graves turned back to the Road King and got on it, and the engine caught on the first kick, the cold weather shudder running through the frame and into his hands, and he pulled out onto the track heading west as the eastern headlights broke through the last line of trees behind him. What followed was 3 minutes that he would never describe accurately to anyone, because accuracy would require separating things that happened simultaneously. The headlights in his mirrors, the track turning to gravel, turning to the state highway, Cutter's voice on the radio saying, "We're clear, west route, go." The moment when the pursuing vehicles reached the highway and turned east instead of west because someone had made a wrong call about which way the targets had gone. The sound of his own engine opening up on the empty Christmas highway, with the mountains on both sides, and the sky going dark purple at the edges, where the short winter day was already surrendering. He rode west. He rode until the mirrors showed nothing but dark highway, and the radio went quiet. And then he pulled off at a rest stop outside the city and sat on the bike in the cold and breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The engine ticked as it cooled. Somewhere beyond the rest stop's tree buffer, a truck moved through on the interstate, its lights sweeping across the sky and fading. He was still holding together. He checked that the way you check a structure after stress, testing each load-bearing element, making sure nothing had given way that looked like it was holding. His hands were steady. His thinking was clear. The thing in his chest that had been pressing against its seal since a highway ditch in a blizzard was still there, still pressing. But it was a different pressure now, less like rupture and more like something that needed room to exist and was negotiating for it. He called Dutch. "We're out," he said. "Both of them." Dutch was quiet for 2 seconds. "I'll tell her." He heard, in the background of the call, a small voice ask something. He heard Dutch say, low and warm, "Yeah, both of them." And he heard the sound that followed, which was not words, which didn't need to be words, which was a 7-year-old child's body releasing 17 days of held terror in a single long exhale that Dutch's phone carried across the winter air to a man sitting on a motorcycle at a highway rest stop. Graves put the phone in his pocket. He sat in the cold for another minute. Then he started the bike and rode into Spokane. The arrests began on December 27th. Not all of them at once. These things moved at the pace of warrants and coordination and the particular institutional care of an inspector general's office that understood it was building something that had to hold under scrutiny from every direction. Okafor had reached the duty officer on Christmas Day, had transmitted the documents, had sat in the back booth of a diner on Division Street for 6 hours while the duty officer made calls, and the calls moved upward, and the weight of what Celeste Cross had built over 8 years began to assert itself against the machine that had tried to bury it. Judge Richard Weil was the first. His home on the morning of the 27th, 2 DOJ investigators at the door, the warrant signed by a federal judge in a district where Harrow had no established contacts, which was the specific geography Okafor had engineered because she understood that geography mattered when the system you were using was partially occupied by the people you were arresting. Gerald Strauss was second. Raymond Holt, special agent in charge, FBI Seattle field office, the man in the photograph with his hand on Harrow's arm, was third, and his arrest generated the kind of institutional silence that follows a large thing falling in a small room, the silence of an entire bureaucracy processing what it meant that the corruption had reached that high and gone undetected that long. Vincent Harrow was fourth. His attorneys filed injunctions within the hour, and the injunctions were denied within 2 hours, and by the afternoon of December 28th, he was in federal custody on charges that Okafor described to Priest over the phone as comprehensive, which was the word a precise person used when they meant devastating. Cascadia View Institute was placed under federal administration pending investigation. The patients, all of them, including the ones Celeste's files had documented and the ones Davies's records had confirmed, and 3 others that the investigative team found in the intake records, were transferred to legitimate medical facilities for evaluation and, where applicable, immediate discharge, Davies testified. His wrist had been set properly at a hospital on Christmas night, a story that he told the treating physician involved a fall on ice, which the physician appeared to accept with the specific incuriosity of someone who understood that some stories were told for reasons that didn't require examination. The trials would take time. These things always took time. But the architecture of the case was solid in the way that Celeste Cross had made it solid, documented, cross-referenced, corroborated by multiple independent sources, built with the patience of someone who understood that the goal was not speed, but durability. It held. The diner on Division Street was called Maze. and it had been open since 1987, and it served coffee in white ceramic mugs that were thick enough to retain heat for a serious amount of time. And it was open at 6 in the morning on the last day of December when Graves walked in and took the booth in the back and ordered coffee and waited. Celeste and Ivy arrived together. Celeste was walking on her own now, the medication fully cleared after 3 days of careful management by physicians who were accountable to someone other than Vincent Harrow. She was thin, and there were shadows under her eyes that would probably be there for a while. And she moved with the careful deliberation of someone relearning the parameters of a body that had been managed by other people's decisions for too long. But she walked in under her own power, and she sat across from Graves in the booth, and she looked at him with those eyes that Ivy had inherited, and she said simply, "Thank you." Ivy climbed in beside her mother and fit herself against her mother's side with the absolute naturalness of a body that had been designed for exactly that position, and Celeste's arm went around her with the same absoluteness, the two of them completing a shape that had been broken for 17 days and was now, imperfectly and at significant cost, restored. Graves wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. The ceramic was hot through his palms, and he held on to it. "The locket," he said. He put it on the table between them. Celeste reached out and took it and turned it in her fingers, looking at it the way you look at something that has traveled a long way back to you, with relief and with a complicated species of grief for the distance it had to travel. Ivy looked at Graves. "You kept it safe." "You told me to." She considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and produced something, holding it out across the table toward him. It was small and silver, and when he picked it up, he saw it was a star. A simple 5-pointed star, the kind that came from a craft store, but it had been polished until it caught the diner light and threw it back clean. "Dutch helped me find it," she said. "I wanted to give you something." He looked at it in his palm. The star was light, almost weightless, the kind of thing that should have been nothing and was somehow not nothing. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know." She held his gaze with those eyes. "You're my hero." The word landed in the diner's warm air and stayed there. He didn't have a response to it that was adequate, and he understood, in the way he understood certain things only when he stopped arguing with them, that adequate was not what was required. What was required was just to receive it, to let it exist without deflecting it or diminishing it or wrapping it in the armor of self-deprecation that had been his reflex for so long he'd stopped noticing he was doing it. Chip chip tut. He closed his fingers around the star. Outside the diner window, a gray Spokane morning was assembling itself from the dark, the sky going from black to purple to the specific flat white of a winter dawn, the street empty except for a single truck making a delivery somewhere down the block. The city looked ordinary. It looked like a city that didn't know what had happened inside it and was going about its business accordingly, and he supposed that was both true and appropriate, because the city was always mostly people who didn't know, and they deserved a morning that looked like a morning. Priest came in at 6:15, then Cutter, then Boone, then Dutch, then Holloway, and Ruiz. The chapter filling the back of May's diner in pieces, taking chairs and booths and ordering coffee without fanfare. The gathering of people who had no ceremony for this because they had never needed one. They just showed up, the way they always showed up, quietly and without announcement, in the places where someone needed them to be. Davies came in last, his splinted wrist in a sling, and took the chair at the end of the table closest to the door with the habit of a man who had recently internalized the value of knowing where the exits were. Nobody made a speech. Nobody said anything that tried to encompass what the last 6 days had been, because there was no sentence built for that, and everyone in the room was old enough to know it. They drank coffee. Boone told a story about a mechanical problem with his van on the ride back from the hunting property that was either very funny or not funny at all depending on your proximity to the situation. And it turned out that even proximity to the situation didn't prevent it from being, at 6:15 in the morning in the warm back of a diner, genuinely funny. And the laughter that followed was the kind that comes from relief more than humor and doesn't need to justify itself. Celeste laughed. It was the first time Graves had heard it, and it was the laugh of someone who had been told they'd forgotten how and was discovering that the body remembers what the mind gives up on. Ivy looked up at her mother's face when the laugh came, and her own face did something that was too large for a 7-year-old face to fully contain. Pure, uncomplicated, the joy of someone whose most important thing had come back. Graves watched them and held the star in his closed fist. He thought about the road south, about Boise, about the motel room with the hot plate and the battery radio and the cot that had been waiting for him to come back to it. He thought about movement as survival strategy, and survival strategy as a substitute for living, the particular long con he'd been running on himself for 26 years since he got on a bus to Fort Benning and didn't look back. He thought about what it cost to stay. He thought about what it cost not to. He ordered a second coffee and sat in the warmth of the diner with the people who had ridden into the same darkness he'd ridden into and come out the other side still intact, still themselves, still here. The conversation moved around him, and he let it move and didn't try to catch it all, just sat inside it the way you sit inside something that you hadn't known you were missing until you were in it. Ivy fell asleep against her mother's shoulder at some point, small and warm and genuinely, thoroughly safe. Celeste looked down at her and then across the table at Graves, and she didn't say anything. And he didn't say anything, and nothing needed to be said. Outside, the Iron Saints' motorcycles lined the curb in the winter morning, parked in a row that was neither neat nor sloppy. The natural geometry of machines that belonged to people who had places to be and would get to them when the time came. The cold kept them still and quiet, chrome going silver in the rising light, leather saddlebags holding whatever their riders carried from town to town. They would ride again tonight. That was the nature of it. There was always a next thing, always another road, always somewhere in the dark where someone was running out of options, and the only thing between them and the worst version of what happened next was people willing to show up in the weather. But not yet. For now the coffee was hot, and the diner was warm, and outside the window the last morning of the year was coming up clean and cold over a city that had just, at significant cost, been made fractionally more honest than it was before. Ryder Graves opened his hand and looked at the small silver star in his palm. He thought, stay. Not forever. Maybe not even long. But past this morning, past the first instinct to pack the bags and point the bike south and put the distance between himself and anything that mattered enough to hurt. Past that. He closed his fingers around the star again and reached for his coffee and let the warmth of it move through his hands and up his arms and into the cold places that had been cold for a very long time. Through the window, the city turned from gray to white to the first pale gold of a winter sun finding the gaps in the clouds. And for a few minutes, the street outside May's diner was lit with the particular light that only comes at the turning of a year, clear and specific and entirely without mercy. The kind of light that shows everything exactly as it is. It was enough. It was, he thought, more than enough.